So what I wanted to do today was, as you saw on the little advert, is to go into what the malacha that we're going to look at is the malacha of Tofer. And Tofer is sewing, binding things together. So if we just have a look at it, we'll see that it's connecting one thing to the other. And we'll see how this plays itself out. So the essential English understanding of it is tightly attaching two flexible surfaces, and that's important, flexible surfaces, because putting two pieces of wood together is not necessarily the malacha. It might be a tolda, but it's not necessarily the malacha itself, right? By means of a third material. So sewing is the obvious example, and that's why it's called tofer. Tofer means sewing. It's not exactly clear if you look in the into the mafarshim, into the commentaries, exactly where tofer worked in the Beit Hamikdash or in the Mishkan. Remember, every one of the 39 malachas are derived out of what was done in the Mishkan. So it's not clear whether they sewed in the Mishkan, because we do know that the massive tapestries, enormous tapestries that covered the Mishkan. The thing is that, according to many opinions, those tapestries were there's another malacha which deals with what's it called, weaving. Those are different malachas. But this is specifically the malacha of sewing. But those tapestries were weaved, and they were enormous. And according to most opinions, the whole tapestry was weaved. There was no sewing within the tapestry itself, but this big, massive sheet. So where was their sewing? So therefore, according to that opinion, the sewing was just they needed to do some little rudimentary repairs, that they'd have to sew things, maybe when they moved it from one place to another, that it may have got damaged. So therefore, it's not 100% sure where Tofer comes in, but it's definitely a malacha. Okay, and the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos says the following, very simple. HaTofer shtei tfirot chayav. If you sew 2 stitches, you're chayav, you're obligated, you're liable. Now, 2 stitches mean that you would go through the material once, then through the bottom material, and then come back up again, like you do when you sew, just sewing like that. How does that work? And that's when you tie the threads on each side. Why? In order that the stitch holds and it doesn't undo. And immediately you can see that according to the Rambam, there has to be some amidah, there has to be some holding of the stitch. If it's just going round and round and it's not, doesn't hold necessarily, as he says, if you do more than 2, then it's much more difficult to undo the stitch. But if only 2, then it just generally will just come straight out. And that's why he says, it says, even if you stretch the thread, then that's already part of the malacha of tefillah, because that's what you need in order to do tefillah. That's like when you take that little piece of cotton, you put it in your mouth, because you have to put it to that ridiculously small eye of the needle, right? So that would already be the preparation of the thread for the stitching on Shabbos, and that would already be a problem. Okay. Sorry, do you want to ask a question? Okay, let's carry on. So the other examples that are of it, remember, it has to be something that is pliable, that is not something that's absolutely solid. So taping together parts of a paper that is torn. So let's say, for example, your siddur tears on Shabbos. So if your siddur tears on Shabbos, you can't stick it together. We all know that. You can't use glue. What about a gummed envelope, for example? You've got, those envelopes that are gummed on the one side and the other. You can't close them together. Obviously, stapling is the same thing. You can't staple papers together. And even if it's a temporary connection, right, the tofer itself is forbidden. Those are absolute examples of tefillah itself. What we're going to now look at is a little bit of stuff where it's a little bit grayer. Why? Yes.
So can I ask, on the temporary, is something like press stick then going to fall into that category?
So we're going to get into press stick.
Okay,
we're going to get into press stick. Good question. Okay. So says the Ramah. The Ramah, remember, that's Rav Moshe Isserles. Rav Moshe Isserles says, and this kind of answers your question without answering, you'll see. We'll see it. This comes up later. Rav Moshe Isserles quotes from the Ramah, from the Beis Yosef, where the Beis Yosef says V'yesh matirin b'tfira she'ena shel kayam. Says there are those people who say that tfira, some type of stitch, some type of stitching in some way that is not going to be permanent. Some people say it's okay. But however, he says, "Va'ein lahatir bifnei am haaretz," but you have to be very careful. I mean, the simple person. Sorry, that's a direct translation that I got of Svaria, but it's not a correct translation. An am haaretz is not a simple person. An am haaretz is a person who doesn't know or understand halacha. So, what's the issue? If you allow temporary, non-permanent stitching, then a person who doesn't understand it will say, "Oh, I'm allowed stitching." So we have to be very careful with what we are allowed, what we do allow, and what we don't allow, based on what this Ramah says. Because how many of us really understand halacha properly, that we won't make those subtle, nuanced mistakes? I think very few of us, if any of us, and I include myself in that. And so, therefore, when we have these strictures, we have to use them in order to ensure that we don't. We're not over on anything in that way. Okay, so let's carry on. The Shulchan Aruch says, and it's a very powerful and very important Shulchan Aruch, because this Shulchan Aruch sets the scene for everything. Hamadabek nayarot or orot, a person who sticks together paper or skins, orot, but kolan shel sofrim. Kolan is like this glue. The glue of the scribes. The scribes used to use to stick things together, to stick papers together, to stick cloth together. That's what they would use. They would make sure that it's permanently stuck. Or any other type of glue of any sort. Hareze told us, Tofer, that's considered to be a tolda. Remember, you've got av malachot, you've got the major, the main category, and then you've got subcategories to that. That's a tolda. That's a tolda of Tofer. Chayav, and that in such a person you're chayav. Now, this is not to do with Tofer, but this is an important halacha that comes out of it. You're not allowed to separate pages that are stuck together either, or skins. I don't know who's got skins in 2021 that they might be using, but if anyone's got skins, don't separate them. V'lo niskaven l'kalkel bilvad. And even if your intention is not to destroy, right? It's a subset, it's a tolda of Korea, which is tearing. So how does that manifest itself? We very often find in the books that we use, maybe somebody was using their books before, especially if there are kids around, and a little bit of a sticky something, or if it was used on Shavuot and they were eating their cake, in the days before COVID, when people would like eat and learn and they could do all the things together. So they're busy eating a little bit and maybe a small piece of sticky substance lands on the page. Those two pages are now stuck together. You're not allowed on Shabbos to separate those pages. Right? That's considered to be Korea, because they are stuck together with some type of glue or some sticky substance that keeps them together. So one should be careful. If the halacha is also, even if you've got a brand new siddur, for example, and the pages are like stuck together, you have to be careful, because it could be the reason that they stuck together is that when the guillotine cut the pages, didn't cut them properly. So if you would separate the pages, you may be separating a small connection together. If you do that, then that's a malacha of Korea, which is tearing. So just be aware of that in the future. Okay, but the Magen Avraham says the following, that im nidbaku, I'm sorry I didn't put it in the English translation, im nidbaku hadapim lahadadi, if the pages are stuck to each other, alidei shaiva or b'shas hakshira, right? He says, I don't agree with the Shulchan Aruch. Because if for some reason they may have been stuck together through shiva, which is wax or something, b'shas hakashira muta lepatchan, he says you can open them. Why? Because when they were stuck together, the lo naseh lekiyum, that wasn't done for them to be done permanently. How much more so when it just happens to be that way. So what comes out la halacha is that you have to be careful, because you may separate the pages, but you might tear them as well. If you tear the pages of a siddur, or of a book, or anything like that, that's problematic. Not only the separating of the two pages, but this concept of lo na'aseh lekiyum is going to come up, where it wasn't done for permanent, that they were put together, is going to come up a little bit later as we go on, and you'll see where it's quite a fascinating story. So what's excluded out of the issue of Tofer? Tofer bringing two things together. So number one, Velcro. Velcro is not an issue. Why is Velcro not an issue? And we'll see now. With buttons. What about buttons? Why, when I take my button and I put it into my shirt, that's not considered to be Tofer holding two things together? Because a button's a button. It's not, you're not sewing things together. You're simply using what the button is there for. The button is there to hold the shirt on. However, we have to remember, by the way, if your button comes off on Shabbos, so let's say your button falls off, what do you do now? So firstly, you have to be very careful not to pull out the cotton that would have been attached to the button, because in doing that, you're doing the opposite of Tofer, which is koreh. You're pulling out the cotton. Secondly, the button itself, that button, you can't put that back on. You're not allowed to put it back on, obviously, because that would be the absolute example of saying that button becomes muktzah. So you have to be careful if a button falls off on what to do and how to make sure that you're not machal Shabbos in that way as well. And finally, safety pins. Now let's have a look. So Velcro. Velcro, there's this concept which we have in halacha called derech tashmisho. That's the second little block there, which is its normal use. When you use something in its normal use, when it's not cooking or anything of those things, which by definition will change the essence of the thing that you're doing it with, then there's no real creative element in that. And the whole point of malacha is creative activity. It's not work. It's creative activity. So since Velcro's purpose is to open and close the way it does, there's no creative element when you take I just bought my daughter new shoes today. And they've got Velcro. So all it's done is the purpose is to close and open, make sure the shoe stays on. But that's part of it. And since that is the case, it's not meant to be a permanent fixture. And since it's not permanent, which Laura, this is going to go back to your stuff and keep thinking about this. Since it's not permanent, you don't have to worry about Velcro. But in terms of the Velcro, the best example, actually, obviously I'm in this parasha now, is nappies. Okay. Now, why is it's a fundamentally important example, nappies, because nappies were not always made the way they are made today. And because they weren't always made the way they are made today, so therefore there was an enormous amount of halachic discourse. Can you imagine, right, on nappies, right? So obviously the ones with the old days, the safety pins, and that, I mean, can you imagine? It's terrible, right? With the safety pins and those towels, that was mutar. Why was it mutar? Because it certainly wouldn't be on for 24 hours. 24 hours is the time of which we call is like permanence. That's the concept of permanence. But then they created these thing called the disposable nappies. Now, when they created disposable nappies originally, there were those adhesive tabs. What that was is that you'd take off like plasters. It's very similar. You take off that little piece of adhesive thing, and you would and then you would stick it down. So the thing is there, the plastic's put on in the factory and remains there for days, if not weeks. So in other words, the plastic that you have to remove off to expose the adhesive strip, okay, is by definition there for longer than 24 hours, which means when you pull it off, it might be prohibited. But I'm going to throw this back to you and ask you, how do we know that maybe it's not prohibited? Where would we've seen it already today, right? We've seen it from someone who would have said to us that it's not prohibited. I'm going to go back a bit. So if you go to this Magen Avraham, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable when you really know halacha. And I mean, I learned this because I was preparing the shir. I didn't even know this Magen Avraham until I just saw it. Yeah, but it's unbelievable because when you know this, you can see that according to many opinions, it wasn't a problem to take off that plastic because the whole plastic was lo na'aseh l'kiyum. It wasn't there to be stuck down. It was there to be opened up and taken off in order that you could put on the nappy. Okay, and the same thing will apply when you take it off because now you got to remove the thing. So now so that's the one thing. Then there's these restickable adhesives. That's where you put it on and you take it off. That is also much easier to find heterium to do. And ultimately nowadays it's all Velcro. It's a very sophisticated kind of Velcro. And so you don't have to worry at all today with nappies. But I remember when we first started with nappies, right? So there were the difference of opinions that were coming out was that because it was an adhesive tab or a restickable adhesive, so then people were suggesting that you took off that the adhesive part before Shabbos to prepare it for Shabbos so that it wasn't being removed on Shabbos itself. However, there was a great sage, Rav Yosef Kapach. Now, Rav Yosef Kapach was unbelievable. He actually was from the Yemenites, great rabbis. He was unbelievable. He was an incredible Talmid Chacham, and so therefore everybody came to him to ask questions. But the most important thing that he did, that we have as part of his legacy, is that Rav Yosef Kapach went, and if you remember that the Taimanim, the Yemenites Rebbe, their like major Rebbe was the Rambam, which meant that they had in their gnizas and in their storehouses and in their libraries original handwritten manuscripts from the Rambam himself or from his Talmidim. Now that makes an enormous difference because we, as Ashkenazi Jewry, have been learning off the Rambam that was first printed whenever it was first printed. And you can imagine when it was printed, there may have been some mistakes. There were mistakes. Firstly, the original Rambam was written in what language? Anybody know? The Mishnah Torah of the Rambam that we know today, that we use as our definitive halachic sefer, was actually written in Arabic. So by definition, it's translation. So you have different translations, sometimes are right, sometimes are wrong. So what he did, Rav Kapach, is he took the Rambam, okay, and he compared it to all these old manuscripts that they had. It's unbelievable. Together with commentaries that they had also from Yemen. And he rewrote much of the Rambam in many places. Where there were things that just didn't make sense, he went into the original manuscripts, and using those manuscripts, he was able to rewrite. If you remember, part of the brilliance of that and the genius that comes with it is that on Tisha B'Av, if you remember, we one of the things we do is we mourn the burning of these books in the courtyard in France. It was just outside what is now the what's that beautiful? What's that museum? The Louvre. Outside the Louvre, outside the courtyard where they've got that big glass thing, outside that courtyard was the place where they burnt hundreds and thousands of volumes of Talmud and the Rambam. So they burnt what we had. So we didn't have anything. So he was able to kind of like authenticize, for want of a better word, what the Rambam was. And what he says is the following. He says, look in the Rambam. And he says the following. The Rambam says, he says the same thing that that the Shulchan Aruch says, if you take pieces of paper and you stick them together with kolan shel sofrim, with this glue of the scribes. And Rav Kapach says that in actual fact, this concept, which the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam use, this kolan shel sofrim, this glue, that's a glue that starts out liquid and then dries. And it's in its drying that the two items connect. It's like super glue, right? You take the super glue, you put it there. As it dries, you put it together, boom, it connects. So that, he says, in those kind of situations where you start up with a liquid and you end up with a solid, that's when you have an issue of Tofer, according to the Rambam. And if that's the case, we can use the halacha to help us, because the adhesives on the diapers, on the nappies, doesn't fall into this definition, and therefore he held was no issue whatsoever, even the old ones, that you could do and undo the adhesive. Okay, that was his thing. But remember, the purpose, part of the reason why you're trying to get there is because of what we call covered abrius, because we're worried. I mean, what are you going to do if you don't have nappies that you can use on Shabbos? Okay, safety pins. Safety pins are very simple. Penetrate the surface of the fabric, easily detached from the fabric, and essentially we use safety pins as a temporary thing. They're not there to be used for permanence. So like, you make a problem, you lose a button in your shirt, you just pin it together just as a temporary measure. That's the purpose of the safety pins. But a straight pin, on the other hand, is problematic. Even if you go in, out, and in, just to hold it in a temporary manner, because that's the act of stitching. And if that's the act of stitching, you can't do it. It becomes part of the process of tefillah. Okay, so let's go here. Now, Laura, this is going to now coming to your discussion. What's this business between temporary and permanent? So permanent, in essence, means anything that lasts for at least 24 hours, which, by the way, becomes the conversation around many people will not do are concerned about doing a necktie. Why? Because sometimes what you do with your tie is that you do it and then you just loosen it and you take it off and you leave it there. So if you leave it, let's say, if you put it in Shabbos morning, you put on your tie, and in Shabbos afternoon you take it off and it's still got the knot in it because you haven't taken it off completely. So then that's a problem of Shira. That's a problem it's going to stay for the next 24 hours because you're not going to do anything until the next Shabbos when you have to put it on again. So that might be a problem. The safety pin. So if you intend for it to remain closed for more than 24 hours, then it limits your use. You can pierce the fabric once and no more. In other words, you can just go through once, because the minute you do it twice, then it's by very definition, the permanence of the connection is enhanced, and that becomes a problem. What about plasters? Okay, so somebody's got a sore and they need a plaster. Are you allowed to use plasters on Shabbos? It's a very, very big discussion. I mean, everything's a big discussion because, everybody's got an opinion, but it's a big discussion because it's not only about the plaster. It's also, if you remember, there are certain restrictions on Shabbos about medication and medical treatment. So the question is, does plasters fall into that? So Rav Melamed, who are from the Sefer Pnina Halacha, so he's really one of the Gedolei Yisrael today. And he says the following: you can use an adhesive bandage, which in America they call them band-aids, whatever, plasters, to protect a wound or a sensitive area from the friction caused by clothing or other objects. That's the purpose of the plaster, as a general rule. You put it on because it's sore and you don't want it to touch anything. The minute it touches anything, it's sore. Even one who is bothered by a mild ailment can do that. Why? Because the adhesive bandage does not cure, it simply protects. So because it's in itself, it is not a refuah thing, it's simply a protective thing, therefore you can use it. However, you can't take a piece of gauze and put it on your flesh and then cover that with a plaster or a bandage, because then what you're doing is you're binding the plaster to that piece of paper or gauze, whatever the case is, and that's Tofer mamish. That's a proper, real problem. But most people hold that Tofer doesn't apply to the human body. So therefore, when you stick the plaster onto your skin, there's no issue of Tofer. And anyway, the adhesive bandages aren't meant to remain on the body for a long time, which is why lechatchila, which means in the best correct way to do it, often, let's say you cut your finger on the top of your finger. So what we normally do is we take the plaster and you wrap it around the whole finger. And then it's like, it's like a nice, and you want to make it neat, you don't want to make it like all over. So you wrap it around and it all fits exactly around the finger. Now, you shouldn't do that on Shabbos. Why shouldn't you do that on Shabbos? Because that's permanent. That wrapping will stay around permanently. Even if you take it off, you wash your hands, whatever the case, it comes off, that wrapping stays permanent. One should have tried to avoid that because that could be tefillah, okay? And that's sticking the one item to the other, the one side or the other, and that would be resembling Tofer, and that would be problematic, okay? What is fascinating is the butterfly bandage, right? So what's the butterfly bandage? The butterfly bandage is where you've got a cut, and you take this little plaster bandage thing, and you put it on each edge of the cut, and the whole point is that it brings the cuts together. And the body then naturally will heal that cut because it's held together by this butterfly bandage. So Rav Melamed says you can use a butterfly bandage to hold together the edges of a cut because there are two lenient opinions. Firstly, remember we said there's this concept of that there's no tofer when it comes to the human body. So if there's no tofer when it comes to the human body, then you can certainly hold it together with this butterfly bandage. And second, anyway, it's not sewing. Why? Because it doesn't bind the wound together. What it does is just holds it together so that it can close up on its own. And therefore, using a butterfly bandage on Shabbos would not be a problem. Now, it's fascinating because the question would be that arises out of this is that, are you allowed to give a urgent is the wrong word, a if you've got let's say you've got a wound, which is a deep cut on your hand, okay, that if you don't, that needs a stitch or stitches. Okay, but if you don't stitch it, you're not going to die. It's just, you'll just sort it out. You'll be a bit sore and you'll sort it out after Shabbos. So if you're going to say that there's no tofer when it comes to the body, there's no sewing, doesn't apply to the body, are you allowed to stitch a non-necessary? It's almost like a, what do you, sorry, my words. It's almost like an elective thing. You need it, but you can wait a bit. So are you allowed to make that stitch where it's not absolutely necessary on Shabbos if Tofer doesn't apply? I'm asking the question. I would love to hear one or two people propose an answer at least. Don't be scared. The worst thing to do is you'll be wrong and then we'll laugh at you.
I think it would be better to wait.
Why? If Tofer doesn't apply to the body, why is it better to wait? I'm not saying you're wrong. I just want to understand where you're coming from. So it's interesting. It is better to wait. But the answer is not only because of the Tofer. Remember, when you are stitching, you're also making wounds. You're doing what's called a chabura. You're creating, there's bleeding, there's a whole lot of other stuff that comes with it. And that's whenever, and the reason why I brought that up was not because of that example, just an example that I was thinking of when I was preparing, is often we forget that within one action, there can be multifold different problems in Shabbos that we just have to be aware of. Okay, so that's the butterfly bandage gave us a bit of an allowance to look at that. Then, one of the big things is sticky notes. Now, sticky notes, those little, what do you call them? The sticky notes, you can see in the picture over here. So are you allowed to use sticky notes on Shabbos? So there is a massive discussion on this, and the Chazon Ish and others said absolutely not. Sorry, not the Chazon Ish, Rav Elyashiv. Rav Elyashiv said absolutely not. You can't, because you're taking it off the sticky thing and you're sticking it down, right? However, Shmiras Shabbos says that you can use a sticky note on Shabbos if it's already detached from its pad. So it's not so sticky that it can't be removed without tearing the surface it was placed upon. Now, we know that our sticky notes are much more developed than the original ones, the original 3M sticky notes, and they never break the surface. None of them are that strong. So therefore, the Mishnah Yosef, based on the Chavadas, based on Rav Ovadia Yosef, he says that it's permitted even to remove the sticky note from the pad on Shabbos. So often what we can see, which is a great and a very important thing. So if a person has, in multiple books that they want to read and they want to put some sticky notes, or whatever the case is, as references, one is allowed to do that. One is allowed to use them as markers, or any of that case on Shabbos. It seems to be that it wouldn't be a problem whatsoever. If you want to be strict like the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, and you make sure that you take them off before Shabbos, that's wonderful, and perhaps one should do that. Okay, Laura, this is for you. Okay, sorry, it took us a while to get there. Okay, so what's the story with press stick and binding tape? Let me explain. I'm going to do the binding tape first, because that's book binding tape. So let's say you get a book that's been rebound, and there's tape inside, and the tape is coming off. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to stick it down, because then that's absolute Tofer. The whole purpose of that is to stick the cover or the pages, whatever it is, together. What about press stick? So press stick, in America they call it blue tack or something like that, right? Press stick, the whole purpose, the whole usage of press stick is to stick things from on one surface to another. Now, if you remember, we said right at the beginning, we said from the Ramah that impermanent sticking may in fact be allowed. But when it comes to the practicality of it, we try and avoid it because the Amaritz won't understand it. Now, with press stick, there are two things that you can use. Sometimes people use press stick just to, put things together temporarily, but most of the time, you'll take your press stick and you'll put your picture on the wall, or you'll put two objects or somehow together in order to hold them for a longer period of time. You don't usually use press stick as a temporary measure. I mean, we all have got our kids' pictures sitting on their walls that they drew with press stick. That's whatever, a few months old. So that being the case, it would seem to be that you're not allowed to use it on Shabbos because of Tofer. I'm only using it as an impermanent thing. Let's not forget that Ramah that says that in front of the Amei Aretz, even though I understand that I can use it, they wouldn't really understand, and they will then start using press stick on a more permanent basis. And that really brings us to a very important thing. And that is this idea that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, we are responsible for one another. And we're responsible to make sure that we don't put our michsholim, even if we understand it, into the paths of other people. And really what that presents itself is the way, as Rabbi Taylor and I were discussing, is that you have to decide, we have to decide, like, what are we trying to create? What environment are we trying to create, both on an individual and on a communal level? And that will determine what we're happy to do on Shabbos, because while certain things might be technically okay, understanding that they may have a negative impact on others takes away the technical okayness and actually makes it prohibited in many ways. Okay, and that where press stick would fall, it's somewhat of a gray area, but it seems to be the most place can hold that press stick one shouldn't use on Shabbos. Okay, if there's specific questions, we can deal with that, and we can try and deal with it. Okay, what about magnets? So magnets again are also, there's a lot of discussion around magnets. There's some people say that you can't use magnets at all because they hold things together. Some people that say you can't you've got these letter magnets that you put in the fridge to spell out words. Some people say you can't use it. Others say you can use it. Rav Belsky was the posek of the OU in America. He said you can use magnets, no issue. And Rav Mordechai Willig, who is one of the great Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University today, he says you can play with magnets. You can even use letter magnets on a background, and don't worry about kotev. Kotev means writing. Remember, we spoke about a little bit about writing two letters two letters, creating words, all those things. He says you don't have to worry about it. Magnets are not called tofer. There's no tofer in the fact that you stick one thing to another. And in addition to that, there's no issue of kotev. Okay, this is a big machlokes. Stickers. So kid stickers. We had those stickers that we used on Shabbos that to give a number to make sure that we weren't transgressing the amount of people coming into shul. So those stickers were the purpose of those stickers was never going to be that they would be stuck permanently. Firstly, the most fell off anyway, but the stickers are problematic because generally you use a sticker to stick down and it stays there permanently. And so since it stays there permanently, you shouldn't use it. Now, what about if you've got like a kid that's got a sticker collection? So if the stickers are easily peeled off, stuck on, peeled off, and they come out, whatever, then it's okay. But if they're stuck on firmly and remain for 24 hours, then in main actual fact be prohibited, may be problematic. And this is the reference. Why? Because exactly, if you remember all the way back, the same thing. Even though it's not permanent, we allow it, but we have to be careful. Because the Amaretz, the person who doesn't know, doesn't understand, might do the wrong thing. And stickers, I think, are one of the perfect examples of that. I was discussing with Rabbi Liebenberg, he's one of the Dayanim in Cape Town, about kid stickers. So the difference of opinions when we've sometimes handed them out as prizes on Shabbos. And what bothered me is that why do we hand them out? Because the kids they're unpicked and they're picking them, whatever. But then I saw my kids just like plucking them down on paper, and they were never going to take them off. And I realized that this is what we've got to be careful of, is that whilst they may be created for easy peeling on and off, and that it works, we have to be careful because the Amaretz could use them in an incorrect way. And so therefore we see that there's certain things that we use on an everyday basis that we need to be careful of, And there's certain things that we use on an everyday basis that are really no issue whatsoever. The point, as we discussed before, is just simply to have a consciousness of what one can and what one can't do. And Rabbi Weinberg said to me when I told him about the shear, so he said to me, the importance of the shear is not only the information that we sit and discuss. The importance of the shear is also the fact that because we're learning about Hilchos Shabbos, so we all have a better consciousness of, can I do this? Should I be able to do this? Shouldn't I be able to do this? Oh, this is something I need to ask about. And that's the most important part. Bezrat Hashem, there will actually be the flow of this year. I forgot to mention it at the beginning, but it was my sister's yahrzeit on Sunday. So I hope you don't mind if the learning that you have and the Shabbos that you keep in this area, at least, will be in her merit. Her name was Chaya Shalom Sarah Meira, Bas Reb Chaim, and please God, her neshama should have an aliyah. If anybody wants us to learn in merit of, in honor of, in celebration of, please let us know at the beginning of the year, and then we do it with absolute pleasure. That's what we're here for. We're able to go through life cycles together as a community. God bless everybody. Have a beautiful week. Enjoy your Shabbos.
Thank you.